Archie was so little, and I had just gotten pregnant with Lily around that same time, so we were now. The passion fruit comes up.
Good without you.
The cameras were supposed to look forward. Instead, they reached backward. According to multiple industry and family-adjacent sources, a new Netflix development tied to Meghan Markle has reopened old wounds inside her own family. What began as routine background research allegedly evolved into what insiders describe as a dig into deeply personal history, including periods her mother preferred remain private. At the center of the fallout stands Doria Ragland, a figure long portrayed as Meghan's emotional anchor. Tonight, we examine how creative ambition collided with family boundaries, why the scrutiny cut so deeply, and how a project meant to shape narrative may have fractured trust behind the scenes. The pitch was framed as evolution, not excavation. According to people familiar with early development conversations, Netflix approached the next phase of its work with Meghan Markle, believing audiences wanted depth rather than polish. Not just what came after royalty, but what came before it. The idea sounded reasonable. Context sells, backstory humanizes. But as planning moved from outline to research, the direction subtly shifted. What began as routine background verification expanded into narrative inquiry. Researchers requested timelines. Producers asked for corroboration. Consultants flagged gaps that, in their view, might invite external criticism if left unexplored. According to insiders, the language used internally was defensive rather than sensational. Preemptive clarity, narrative integrity, closing loops before others do. That logic drove the scope outward and backward. By late development meetings, attention had turned toward family history, not as color, but as structure. The argument was simple. Meghan's public story has always emphasized resilience shaped by upbringing. To tell that story convincingly, producers believed the foundation had to be examined with more rigor than before, not revisited lightly, examined. That examination raised immediate discomfort among family-adjacent figures. The concern was not exposure, but emphasis. Background details that had once been footnotes were now being discussed as potential chapters. The closer the lens moved toward the past, the less abstract the consequences became. At the center of those consequences stood Doria Ragland. For years, Doria had occupied a carefully defined role in Meghan's public narrative. Present, supportive, calm, a grounding presence who appeared selectively and spoke sparingly. According to people who know her, that restraint was intentional. She valued privacy not as branding, but as protection. Her life before Meghan's fame was not something she believed belonged to an audience. The Netflix process, insiders say, tested that boundary. Requests began arriving indirectly. Clarifications about dates, questions about periods rarely discussed publicly, inquiries framed as verification rather than revelation. Each question on its own seemed manageable. Together, they suggested a direction Doria had never agreed to travel. Meghan's advisors viewed the situation through a different lens. They worried about vulnerability gaps. In the current media climate, silence invites speculation. Leaving unanswered questions, they argued, would allow others to define the story. From their perspective, addressing history directly was a form of control, not exposure. That divergence in instinct marked the first real strain. According to people familiar with the conversations, Meghan believed transparency would neutralize criticism. She had lived through years of commentary shaped by partial information. The idea of telling the story fully, on her terms, felt like reclamation. What she underestimated, insiders say, was how differently her mother experienced that same history. For Doria, the past was not a narrative asset. It was lived time, decisions made without cameras, circumstances navigated without public interpretation. The suggestion that those years might be unpacked on screen felt invasive, regardless of intent. Early objections were expressed quietly, requests to limit scope, to avoid certain periods, to keep focus on the present. Producers listened, but the process continued. Once a project reaches a certain scale, momentum becomes difficult to redirect. Research teams keep researching. Story editors keep outlining. By the time concerns reached a more formal stage, the direction was already in motion. Industry insiders describe a familiar dynamic. Platforms like Netflix invest heavily in authenticity. The more personal a story, the stronger its market position. That incentive structure rewards depth, even when depth creates discomfort. Creative teams often believe they are honoring subjects by taking them seriously. Families often experience that seriousness as intrusion. The tension sharpened when questions shifted from general background to specifics. According to people close to the family, Doria pushed back more firmly at that stage. She questioned the necessity. She asked who would control framing. She worried about how nuance would survive editing. Meghan, caught between creative ambition and maternal loyalty, reportedly struggled with the impasse. Those close to her say she felt misunderstood. In her view, telling the full story was an act of honesty. In her mother's view, it risked reopening doors that had been intentionally closed. The disagreement did not erupt. It settled into something quieter and more corrosive. Communication slowed, alignment frayed. Where once there had been unspoken unity, there was now negotiation. Netflix executives were made aware of the sensitivity, according to industry sources. Discussions took place about scope and tone, but no clear resolution emerged. The platform's interest lay in narrative completeness. Family concerns lay in personal boundaries. Those priorities rarely align without compromise. What made the situation especially fraught was the contrast between public image and private tension. Meghan and Doria had long been presented as a united front. Any visible fracture would invite scrutiny neither wanted. That pressure encouraged silence rather than confrontation. As development continued, insiders noticed a shift. Doria's presence in planning conversations diminished. Invitations became less frequent. Alignment that once seemed automatic now required effort. The cooling was subtle, but unmistakable to those watching closely. By the time word of the disagreement began circulating beyond the immediate circle, the story had already taken shape internally. A project meant to consolidate narrative control had begun to test the most intimate relationship in Meghan's life. This was not about scandal. It was about boundaries, where storytelling ends and family begins. And whether ambition, however well-intentioned, can override the quiet agreements that hold relationships together. The cameras were not yet rolling on anything controversial. No scenes had aired, no claims had been made publicly. Yet the damage, insiders say, had already begun. Trust, once strained, does not rebound easily. What started as a creative decision now carried personal consequence. And as the project looked further back, the cost of that backward glance became harder to ignore. This was the moment the story stopped being about content and became about consent. Not legal consent, emotional consent. The kind that cannot be contractually enforced and cannot be repaired once disregarded. By the end of this phase, the fault line was visible, even if unspoken. A Netflix project designed to deepen understanding had instead exposed a difference in values. Between a daughter determined to control her narrative and a mother determined to protect her past, that difference would shape everything that followed. The questions did not arrive as accusations. They arrived as follow-ups. According to people familiar with the exchanges, producers framed each inquiry as housekeeping, the kind of due diligence that protects a project from later challenge. Dates needed alignment. Gaps required explanation. Silence, they warned, would be interpreted by others if not addressed directly. That rationale carried weight inside the production. It also carried risk inside the family. At the center of the friction stood Doria Ragland, who had long drawn a bright line between support and exposure. She had agreed to appear when it served her daughter's work. She had never agreed to become material. The distinction mattered to her, and it had guided her choices for years. The research process challenged that distinction in incremental ways. According to insiders, requests moved from confirmation to context, from context to interpretation. A period of absence here, a relocation there. Each item came wrapped in professional language, but together, they suggested a deeper excavation than Doria was comfortable with. Meghan's advisors saw the same requests differently. They viewed them as armor. In their assessment, unaddressed questions become weapons in the hands of critics. If the story did not cover certain periods, others would. Better to shape the narrative than chase it later. That calculation has governed much of Meghan's media strategy since she entered public life. The problem was not intent, it was ownership. For Meghan Markle, the past is inseparable from the present. Her public arguments about identity, resilience, and agency draw strength from origin stories. She has often spoken about the power of naming one's truth before others distort it. In that framework, completeness feels ethical. For Doria, completeness felt invasive. The years in question were not chapters waiting to be published. They were lived experiences shaped by constraint, compromise, and privacy. She did not see omission as deception. She saw it as dignity. Those opposing instincts collided during planning calls that insiders describe as tense but controlled. Doria asked why certain periods mattered to the story. Producers answered with metrics and precedent. Viewers demand specificity. Documentaries are scrutinized for gaps. Omission invites suspicion. The logic was professional. The impact was personal. Meghan attempted to mediate. According to people close to her, she argued that the project could handle sensitive material with care. That intention did not resolve the underlying concern. Care still requires exposure. Editing still selects. Once filmed, control shifts from subject to structure. The turning point came when producers proposed exploring not just events, but motivations. That move reframed the exercise. It was no longer about what happened, but why. For Doria, that crossed a line. Motivation belongs to the person who lived it, not to a narrative team assembling an arc. She pushed back more directly at that stage. Insiders say she asked to narrow the scope and keep focus on Meghan's adult life. She questioned the necessity of contextualizing her own decisions. She worried that complexity would be flattened into implication once translated for screen. Those concerns did not halt the process. The machine continued to turn. Research teams kept compiling. Story editors kept outlining. In high-stakes productions, momentum often outruns consent. No one issues a stop order unless a legal boundary is crossed. Emotional boundaries are easier to test. This created an imbalance. Doria's objections were treated as sensitivities to be managed, rather than limits to be respected. From the production's perspective, the project belonged to Meghan. From Doria's perspective, parts of it belonged to her, and she had not given them away. The disagreement began to color other interactions. Insiders noticed a change in tone. Conversations that once felt collaborative became transactional. Where Doria had previously offered guidance freely, she now asked how information would be used. Trust thinned. Meghan's advisors grew uneasy. They worried that unresolved family tension could jeopardize the project or, worse, surface publicly. At the same time, they feared that scaling back would undermine the very premise that made the content valuable. The solution they pursued was reassurance rather than revision. Promises of sensitivity. Assurances of editorial respect. Those assurances did not address the core issue. Control. Doria wanted veto power over her past. The production could not grant it without weakening narrative authority. Meghan stood between them, aligned emotionally with her mother, aligned strategically with the project. That position is isolating. Every choice feels like betrayal of one side or the other. As the weeks passed, the cost became visible. Doria's participation receded. Her availability narrowed. According to people familiar with scheduling, she declined some meetings altogether. When present, she limited discussion. The warmth that once characterized her involvement cooled into caution. Netflix executives were briefed on the sensitivity, according to industry sources. They asked whether adjustments could be made without compromising the story. The answer was equivocal. Adjustments? Yes. Retreat? No. The platform's investment depended on perceived authenticity. Authenticity, in this calculus, required confronting the past rather than skirting it. Publicly, nothing changed. Mother and daughter appeared aligned. The image held. Privately, the gap widened. What made the rift painful was its asymmetry. Meghan's life had already been absorbed into public narrative. Doria's had not. The project threatened to pull her into a space she had deliberately avoided. The difference in tolerance for exposure became the fault line. Insiders describe moments of quiet frustration on both sides. Meghan felt her commitment to honesty was being misread as exploitation. Doria felt her insistence on privacy was being reframed as obstruction. Neither believed they were wrong. Both believed they were being asked to sacrifice something essential. By the time whispers of disagreement reached industry circles, the dynamic was set. Research had crossed into intrusion not because of malice, but because ambition had eclipsed consent. The project's promise of truth now carried a price, measured in family trust. This was no longer a debate about content. It was a negotiation over ownership of memory. Who decides which parts of a life become story? Who bears the consequences when those decisions are made? The answers did not arrive cleanly. They accumulated in pauses, in missed calls, in guarded responses. The absence of resolution became its own signal. And in that unresolved space, The relationship that had long been portrayed as unshakable began to strain under the weight of a story that refused to stay contained. The first sign was absence. Not dramatic, not announced, just noticeable to those who tracked patterns. Doria Ragland, who had once been reliably present for alignment calls and quiet check-ins, began declining invitations. When she did appear, she listened more than she spoke. Questions that once received reflective answers now met careful deflection. Insiders say the change was deliberate. Doria had spent years managing a delicate balance: support without spectacle, presence without ownership. She understood how narratives travel once released, and how little control subjects retain after editing. Her resistance was not rooted in fear of exposure, but in refusal to be interpreted by strangers with a mandate to dramatize. The pushback took shape in specifics. She asked which periods were being examined and why. She asked who would contextualize decisions made under constraints no longer visible. She asked whether silence could be respected as a complete answer. The responses did not reassure her. They explained process. They cited audience expectation. They spoke the language of production. That language widened the distance. For Meghan Markle, the resistance landed painfully. Those close to her describe a mixture of disbelief and hurt. She had framed the project as a shared act of honesty, a chance to place her life in a coherent arc rather than fragments assembled by others. To encounter refusal from the person she trusted most felt like rejection of that premise. The disagreement did not become explosive. It became procedural. Messages routed through intermediaries. Calendars tightened. Conversations shifted from open-ended to agenda-bound. The ease that once defined their collaboration gave way to negotiation. Doria's boundary hardened when producers proposed addressing contradictions preemptively. Not allegations, but interpretations. Why certain choices were made. How periods of distance should be understood. The framing implied a need to explain. Doria objected to that need itself. Explanation, she argued, concedes authority to critics who had not earned it. Her position was simple and firm. Her life was not a corrective appendix to someone else's narrative. That firmness forced a recalculation. Without Doria's full participation, the story would lack a key stabilizing presence. With it, the story risked violating the very trust it sought to showcase. Insiders describe tense internal debates. Should the project narrow focus? Should certain segments be dropped? Or should the narrative proceed with acknowledgement of limited access? Each option carried cost. Meghan attempted to bridge the gap. According to people familiar with their exchanges, she argued that restraint could coexist with honesty. That complexity could be preserved through careful framing, that no one intended to assign blame. Doria was unmoved. Intentions, she said, do not control outcomes. Once material exists, it can be repurposed, excerpted, and reinterpreted without consent. That point landed with weight. The cooling was not immediate, but it was unmistakable. Public appearances that once featured quiet alignment began to thin. Scheduling conflicts multiplied. Invitations went unanswered longer. When they did connect, conversations avoided the project altogether. Silence replaced shared planning. Industry observers noticed the shift without knowing its source. The absence of Doria's voice in development chatter raised questions. Had the scope changed? Had access been limited? The answers, when given, were vague. Privacy concerns, scheduling challenges. No one contradicted them, but no one elaborated either. The rift carried an emotional texture that insiders describe as restrained grief. Not anger, disappointment, the kind that comes when values diverge without villainy. Meghan believed she was protecting the truth. Doria believed she was protecting herself. Both positions were defensible. They were also incompatible. As production advanced, the consequences of that incompatibility became practical. Segments that relied on maternal perspectives stalled. Context had to be inferred rather than voiced. Editors debated whether absence should be named on-screen or masked through narrative focus elsewhere. Each decision signaled something, whether intended or not. The strain reached a point where Doria's involvement was no longer assumed. It had to be requested, negotiated, and limited. That shift altered the power dynamic between mother and daughter. Where once there had been shared stewardship of story, there was now guarded permission. Meghan's silence on the matter deepened speculation. Supporters read it as respect for her mother's privacy. Critics read it as damage control. Those closest to the situation described something else entirely: paralysis. Any public acknowledgement risked confirming tension. Any denial risked invalidating Doria's boundary. The family fracture, though contained, became legible to those watching closely. Alignment had given way to distance. The image of unbreakable unity softened into something more human and more fragile. The antagonist here was not Netflix or the press. It was the irreconcilable demand that a story be both comprehensive and consensual when the subject matter belongs to more than one person. In such cases, someone must yield. Doria chose not to. Her pushback did not seek leverage, it sought limits. And in setting them, she changed the project's trajectory, whether acknowledged publicly or not. By the time this phase settled, one reality was clear to everyone involved. The cost of telling the story had risen, not in money or time, but in intimacy. The relationship that once anchored the narrative now required protection from it. That protection took the form of distance. Distance from meetings, distance from decisions, distance from a process that had crossed from documentation into interpretation. The result was a quiet rift, visible only in what no longer happened. No shared appearances, no collaborative messaging, no easy confirmation of alignment. In public life, absence speaks loudly to those trained to listen. This was the moment the project stopped being a joint endeavor and became a solitary one. A story driven forward by ambition and constrained by a boundary that refused to move. And once that boundary was set, everything else had to bend around it. The silence around the project became its own story, not in the tabloids, not yet, but within the small network of industry professionals who track tone more than headlines. They noticed the absence first, no new mentions of Doria Ragland, no updates about family collaboration, no soft interviews to reinforce unity. What had once been a shared narrative between mother and daughter was now split cleanly down the middle. Inside Netflix, the tension created unease. The project had promised depth, and depth meant access. Without Doria, the foundation felt incomplete. Producers debated quietly whether the gap should be concealed or contextualized. Some argued that omission would invite speculation. Others believed transparency would dignify the decision. In the end, omission won. They wrote around her absence, shaping sequences that implied presence through photographs and archival fragments, rather than interviews. For Meghan Markle, that creative decision carried an emotional cost. People close to her describe long pauses during review sessions, moments where silence filled the room as footage of her mother appeared without commentary. One insider said she would nod slightly, signaling approval, but her expression suggested resignation rather than satisfaction. The project was still hers, but it no longer felt wholly controlled. That loss of control was the quiet source of her shame. Not public embarrassment, there had been no leak, no scandal, but the internal recognition that something meant to affirm connection had fractured it instead. Ambition had carried her too far into territory where love should have drawn the line. For someone whose image had been built on loyalty and sincerity, the realization struck harder than any headline could. In her circle, advisors tried to manage perception before perception formed. They drafted talking points that emphasized creative independence and family privacy. They prepared contingency responses in case journalists noticed Doria's absence. But damage control works best when the threat is external. This one was not. It lived inside the story itself. As editing neared completion, word of the family strain reached palace watchers in London. To them, the news felt inevitable. Control, one longtime correspondent remarked privately, has always been her armor and her vulnerability. The palace, by contrast, understands the discipline of omission. It knows that silence, handled properly, can shield as effectively as narrative. Meghan, operating in Hollywood's confessional economy, had reversed that logic, and the cost was personal. In Los Angeles, the situation hardened. Doria withdrew further, declining even informal background checks that might have softened her portrayal. Friends say she felt used for tone, a gentle image inserted without consent. To her, the project represented the kind of exposure she had spent years avoiding: glossy, controlled, but still invasive. Those close to her describe an exhaustion that felt less like anger and more like disappointment. Meghan faced a dilemma familiar to many public figures: the conflict between truth as narrative and truth as relationship. Her truth required storytelling. Her mother's required silence. Both were valid. Both could not coexist. The more she explained her intentions to others, the less she could explain them to Doria. At one point, according to a production source, she asked whether removing family references altogether would preserve peace. The answer from executives was blunt: without family, there was no story. That comment, insiders say, ended the discussion. She signed off on the edit, requested final approval on narration, and withdrew from active involvement. The tone of the film shifted with her less confessional, more curated, polished to the point of distance. The emotional heartbeat that Doria once supplied was replaced with scenic bridges and broader commentary about heritage and identity. When the revised cut screened internally, executives called it measured. Critics, once it leaked to trade press, called it detached. Both were right. What viewers couldn't know, at least not immediately, was that the detachment was not artistic choice. It was consequence. Behind the scenes, the rift persisted. Communication between mother and daughter narrowed to essentials. Public appearances ceased altogether. For a relationship long framed as unbreakable, the absence was striking. Meghan's advisors floated the idea of a joint photograph at an upcoming charity event, but Doria declined. The refusal was polite, final, and unexplainable to outsiders. The irony was painful. The project had aimed to reclaim narrative power, to tell the story on her own terms after years of distortion. Instead, it reinforced the very dynamic she'd sought to escape. A life dissected, relationships defined by what the public did or didn't see. For someone so intent on authorship, losing control of meaning was the sharpest cut. Inside Netflix, the project moved forward quietly. Marketing teams were instructed to emphasize hope and self-discovery rather than lineage. Doria's absence was reframed as respect for privacy. The public, at least for now, accepted that framing. But insiders knew the real reason. Boundaries had finally been enforced by the one person Meghan could not overrule. In private conversations, friends say Meghan has not spoken critically of her mother. She defends her privacy, attributes the distance to creative differences, and changes the subject. Yet, the guilt remains visible in avoidance. A source close to the family summarized it simply: she wanted to honor her mother. She ended up protecting the project instead. By the time editing wrapped, everyone involved understood that the story they'd told was smaller than the one they'd lived. The cameras captured triumph and transformation, but not the cost. The mother who had once steadied the daughter during public storms was now standing outside the frame silent, unconsulted, but present in absence. The final irony is that both women achieved what they wanted. What neither could keep was the uncomplicated trust that had once made both possible. In the end, the shame was not scandalous, not public, not loud. It was the quieter kind that arrives when ambition outpaces empathy, when the story told to the world becomes the one that damages the world closest to you. That is where the project leaves them. Two women defined by strength, divided by interpretation, each certain she protected the other in her own way. And between them, a finished film polished, global, incomplete. Some stories promise empowerment, others demand a price. If you want deeper investigations into how ambition, family, and image collide behind closed doors, subscribe, share your perspective, and join us as we continue unpacking the moments where control meets consequence.